Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about 5 composition techniques that are going to help you up the quality of your food photos. I've got a free composition planning kit download for you linked below. So grab that before we jump in, grab a drink and let's get started. So tip number 1 is to think about your audience. Who are you making this image for? If you're shooting something for a product website, a product catalog, or an advert, it's going to be completely different than if you're shooting something more editorial for a magazine, a food blog, or a recipe website. So this is the first step. Once you know who your audience is, it's going to make choosing things like what props you want to use, what backgrounds you want to use, even how many things you're including in your frame, much easier because you're going to have a sense of who you're creating this image for. So once you know the audience for your image, you can start to think of maybe a few words that might work well with the style of your image. So say for example, you're shooting a drink can for a website that is focused on the product. You might have words like bold or clean and bright, minimal. Whereas if you're shooting something for a really sort of moody editorial style website, maybe it's a recipe that goes alongside something really cozy and farmhousey, then you might have words like dark or misty or wooden. And that's going to help drive the composition for the rest of your image and help you make decisions about what will work best for your story. Tip number 2 is to choose your composition grid. A composition grid is basically a composition technique that you use to help lay out the main elements of your photo. There are a few of these out there, but the most common ones that I find myself using are the rule of thirds, the golden ratio or the phi grid, dynamic symmetry, the golden spiral, and the golden triangle. All of these I teach in depth in my Food Compose course, which you can find inside Food Photography Academy. They all work a little bit differently, and we go through several examples of how to apply them to different angles, different layouts, and different types of food. But I've got a free download for you down below of the rule of thirds grid, which you can print out and use to get started, and we'll talk about that later in this video. So your composition grid is going to form the basis of the layout of your image. Rather than just starting with a blank screen and kind of throwing things in and seeing what maybe looks good and what doesn't and winging it, the composition grid is really going to give you some anchor points where you can really see, okay, my hero is going to look good here, and then you can use the other parts of the grid to help you place your supporting elements to make sure that they're holding up that hero and not overtaking it. So generally in a composition grid, the strongest points are where the lines of the grid meet. So on the rule of thirds grid, for example, this is going to be where those lines intersect. So there's 4 key intersections on this grid, and those are the points that you want to focus on placing your hero. It's also a good tip to place things just a bit off center. Sometimes a completely central look can work, but generally something more off center, so focused on one of those intersections, is going to make your composition a lot more interesting. Then you want to make sure that you're using the other lines to help guide your supporting elements. So you might use them to actually place something on, or you might even use them to choose the direction of something. Often if I've got utensils in the scene like forks, spoons, knives, I'll use the lines of these grids to help me choose the direction that that utensil is going to lay. Not only does this help me just make a decision on where to put it, it also creates things like leading lines, which are another composition technique that you can use in your food photography. Okay, the next tip is to not pile on every single composition technique that you know into one image. Just because we have lots of things at our disposal like negative space, leading lines, triangles, the rule of odds, all sorts, you don't need to use every single one of these techniques in every single image that you shoot. So once you've chosen your composition grid, think about which of the other techniques will actually work and help you to tell the story in your image, rather than just throwing everything but the kitchen sink at it. So for example, in a more minimal image, you might use things like triangles and negative space to help you create breathing room but shape to the things in your image. Whereas in a more busy image, image, you might use a lot more leading lines and C shapes and things like that to help you position things to create framing. But don't try and throw every single thing you know at it, because very quickly your image is going to look overwhelmed, and all of those techniques that you're trying so hard to use are probably going to overtake each other and not even be recognizable. Tip number 4 is to plan out your compositions using sketches before you walk into your shoot. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that this is something I have recommended you do for years. It is something that I do for pretty much every single shoot I do for myself. And down below, I've linked a free printable composition guide that you can use right now to print off and start sketching your photos. So let's talk about how we use it. So make sure you go grab that download and follow along with me. So what I do is I print this out once I've decided on the composition technique that I'm going to use. And I basically try and get a rough idea on paper of what I want the layout of my image to be. Now, you are definitely not going for a really fancy, high quality sketch here. I mean, if you want to go super detailed, feel free to make this exactly what you want it to be. But for me personally, it's mostly to get an idea of structure, lighting, and supporting props. So I will just go ahead and draw a few shapes to kind of indicate my main subject. I'll also make notes about things that I might want to think about for styling, garnishes, supporting props, and then I might also make some extra notes for things like lighting, in terms of the direction, colors that I might want to use, any special shapes that I might want to create. This is the time where I try and get as much of that vision down on paper so that when I walk into the studio and I start to execute my shoot, I've got a good starting point. Most of the time, I don't end up deviating that much from this sketch, and sometimes I do. Sometimes it gives me a starting point, and then when I actually see it all coming together, a light bulb goes off that I think actually something else might work. But I find my shoots overall are so much more successful when I walk into them with this vision. So go grab that free composition planning kit and start planning your sketches today. The rule of thirds is included in that, and then in Food Photography Academy, we have all of the other grids that I talked about earlier in this video as well. And my last tip is kind of a 2-in-1 because it's a tethering tip. So I guess the first tip is to tether. So if you haven't used tethering yet, then give it a go. There are so many free tethering softwares if you're not ready to use something like Capture One yet, but it just gives you a much bigger view of your screen. But then my further tip for this, for making tethering even more useful, is to use a composition overlay of the composition grid that you're using on your screen while you're tethering. So this is going to help you be able to translate that sketch that you did into your image. So rather than kind of looking at your blank screen and guessing where it goes, if you've actually got that composition overlay on the screen, then you can literally compose as you go live using those techniques. If you missed my video a few weeks ago where I walk you through this, I'm going to link that up here, where I basically show you how this works. So you can upload your composition grid into your tethering software. It's super easy if you're using Capture One. I know it's an option on quite a few other softwares as well. And this is really just going to help make your tethering even more effective, especially when it comes to composition. So those are 5 quick tips that you can start putting into action today to help you improve your food photography composition. Don't forget to download your free composition planning kit from the description, and I will see you in the next video.